and I can just talk naturally. You know, I'm kind of improvising around legato here, you know. The technique is the same as it would be if I was playing live, but, you know, my speech is not forced. I'm not kind of like, oh, you know, really straining. There's a vein popping out the side of my head. Hi there guys, Tom Quayle here. Hope you're all doing very well indeed. Sorry for missing a video last week. Back again this week with a myth busting video this time. I want to talk about 5 myths that I hear perpetuated about legato within the guitar community. So we're going to do a little bit of myth busting today, as I say, and talk about some of the things that I think people get confused about with this technique. They think certain things are required, certain bits of gear, certain setup with the guitar, and actually it's not the case, and I want to try and demonstrate some of these things to you today. So before I get started with that, I just want to say really quickly that I'm celebrating currently 2 months since the release of Solo version 2 and the Ultimate Fretboard visualization course, which was released back in January. So to celebrate, I'm actually offering a $50 or equivalent, whatever your currency is, discount code. If you use the code Quayle50, which you can see on screen right now, you'll find the link down below in the video description and also in the pinned comments to go across to the course and of course over to Solo as well, Solo version 2. I think this is the best course. I know I would say this, but I think it's the best course and most powerful course that's ever been created for visualizing the fretboard. Whether you're a beginner or you are a pro player, I think there's a lot to be offered from this course and the Solo app. So check that out, use the discount to get this offer. And yeah, I will see you in the course, guys, and I hope you enjoy it if you do check it out. So with that said, without further ado, let's do some myth busting. And I want to say really quickly, these are just things that have worked for me. They're not necessarily the kind of golden rules of legato. I'm not necessarily the authority, but certainly these ideas and kind of principles in this video are things that have worked for me and should bust a few myths, as I say, for this particular technique. So here is myth number 1. So the first myth that I hear perpetuated all the time is that to play legato, you need to have a super low slammed action with your strings a hair's breadth above the frets. This is absolutely not true, and actually the reason I would suggest you don't do this, and I know a lot of players who do think this way, is because it compromises so many other parts of your guitar playing technique. The way I always think about this is, think about keyboard players. You will hear concert pianists always talking about how they prefer to play on either real pianos with a proper hammer action, where the keys feel A, really consistent when you press them down, and there's a little bit of resistance involved as well. As opposed to playing on, say, a synth. I've got a few synths behind me, and they have kind of very lightweight actions, and you can play really, really fast, and that's fine. That's one aspect of guitar playing. But the problem is that a lot of the other aspects of your guitar playing, such as your tone, the consistency of your playing, your dynamics, your ability to execute other techniques such as vibrato and bending, are all, for me, compromised a step too far. So I like to have my action like a medium low action. I'm going to show you some B-roll now of my guitar. It's not low. My action is not super slammed on any of my guitars. And if your guitar is set up well, and what I mean by that is you've got a relatively straight neck, so it's consistent all the way up to the 12th fret, inevitably obviously higher than that, it gets a little bit higher the action. You should find, if you've got that straight neck, you've got sort of a modern-ish guitar, it doesn't have to be though, with decent frets that are level, you should find that you do not need a low action to be able to execute this kind of... You know, you don't need a super low action. And just to demonstrate this further, I'm now going to show you me doing this on my acoustic guitar. Now in this case, this is a Taylor. It's a 25th, I think, anniversary Taylor, which means it's a very good guitar. It's set up really well, but it's an acoustic with phosphor bronze strings on, 12 to 52. And yeah, it doesn't make it any more difficult to do legato, to have a slightly higher action. We'll talk about strings in a second, but you'll hear, so long as you've got good, consistent technique and the guitar is well set up, which in this case my Ibanez guitars obviously are, and this Taylor is, then you should find you do not need a lower action, and therefore you can execute all the other techniques, such as your vibrato or your bends, much more easily and with much more control and consistency. And that's what I look for in my guitar setup, is consistency, control, and that the guitar feels like something to play. There's some kind of, you know, there's resistance in the instrument, but not too much. So myth number 2 relates back to myth number 1, and these two often go together in that people think that in order to play legato well, you not only need a super low slammed action, but you need really light gauge strings, usually either 8s or 9s. And again, this is absolutely not the case. And for me, actually, I personally find, again, it's too much of a compromise to play on lower gauge strings. Now, I get it completely. I do like playing on lower gauge strings, especially if I'm doing really wild, wide vibrato, for example. But the problem with doing legato on very light gauge strings is twofold for me. First of all, it's a less consistent surface on which to do the hammer-ons and the pull-offs, particularly the pull-offs. So what you tend to find is guitar players, and we'll talk about this later in another myth, who pull off too hard, get a kind of like cat-like meow sound from each of the notes as they pull off, where they're kind of pulling the string out of tune because the string is so light, especially on the top 3 strings, the G, the B and the E, that they're getting this kind of out of tune pull-off sound. Now the other thing is, what I find is with thicker strings, and they can be as thick as you like if you're playing an arch top or an acoustic, again 12 to 52, even 13s is fine, so long as the guitar is really well set up. Every time I go to do a hammer-on or a pull-off, that string is in exactly the same place. I'm not pulling it out of shape. I'm not pulling with my first finger too far. I've got a much more consistent feel from the string from which to do the legato. And again, this relates back to that piano kind of vibe of, do I prefer to have the control from a weighted keyboard? And I play a little bit of keys and I prefer that a lot. My synths actually do have semi-weighted keyboards as opposed to just synth action keyboards. Same thing for me with legato. I don't want to be playing on a surface that's like spaghetti. It's just moving around or like jelly all over the place. I like that consistency. And then again, all of those techniques like this. The vibrato, that kind of violin-esque, Alan Holdsworth-esque vibrato that I like, works really, really well for me with this level of consistency from both the medium low action, not a low action, but medium low, and then those kind of, in my case, 10 to 46. I wouldn't go down to 9s, I might do 9.5, for example. I can't go all the way down to 9s. 8s, I could never play. And I realize, of course, that some of the greatest, if not the greatest legato player of all time, Alan Holdsworth, did use very light gauge strings, and I probably had a low action. Again, this is why I'm saying, for me, it's a myth that you need that to play good legato. This is what I'm saying. It doesn't have to be the case. Okay, so with that said, now let's move on to myth number 3. So the third myth that I want to bust here is that you need ridiculously strong hands, or in this case, left hand. Obviously, if you're a left-handed player, you would be the right hand. And that you need to pull off really hard and slam your fingers down for your hammer-ons. This just is not the case for me at all. In fact, this is a very relaxed technique for me. Again, if you get these setup aspects right of your guitar, and you've got a good consistent technique, and what I mean by consistent technique is that you're using the same part, the tip of the finger each time. You're always curled round like this with the left hand. You're not kind of sometimes a bit flat, sometimes placing on the lower part of the tip of the finger, sometimes just under the nail with the fretting hand. You're very consistent. You can be very relaxed and not have a compromise in your sound. Now, the reason I think this is a bad idea, and this is definitely a myth that should be busted, is because you hear a lot of guitar players complaining about stamina in their legato technique. And I think a lot of this stems from the idea that what we go for when we initially start playing legato is we slam those fingers into the fretboard for the hammer-ons and we pull off really hard to get note volume. And this kind of intuitively makes sense because we don't like to have low volume or non-sounding notes within our playing. But the problem is, by doing this, it's kinetic energy and potential energy, just physics. In order to have the fingers slam into the fretboard like this to get the note volume, you have to tense the muscles up in order to create the potential energy and then slam them down into the fretboard as kinetic energy in order to get the volume. And this tension that you're putting into your hand in order to get the volume, sometimes swinging the palm or swinging the elbow, is not good long-term for your technique because you're basically building in tension in the left hand that shouldn't be there. So actually, I would say the opposite. What you should be doing is going for consistency of finger placement, not rotating the palm, keeping things very, very consistent, as I say, and not worrying about note volume worrying about that consistency, because later down the line you can add the note volume when you've got the consistency, and therefore you won't be building in too much tension before that consistency is there. So don't worry at first if your notes are nice and quiet. I say nice and quiet. If they're quiet, that's not a problem. Now, the other thing is, if I build a whole bunch of tension into my hands and therefore into my wrist, up my arm, up into my shoulder, up into my jaw, for example, and up into the rest of my body, that tension is going to make me play in a much more forced way. I'm going to run out of stamina, and also I'm not going to have the mental wherewithal to be listening, to be thinking about music, to be having a musical conversation in any kind of setting that I find myself in. And you can test this for yourself. If you've built a whole bunch of tension by being too physical with the guitar, you won't be able to hold a conversation with somebody at the same time. Now with my technique, and this is something I always demonstrate on my masterclasses wherever they are in the world to various guitar players, I can actually do this and talk at the same time, and I'll have somebody hold a conversation with me. So I can start the legato. Oh, let me do this a little bit louder. And I can just talk naturally. I'm kind of improvising around legato here. The technique is the same as it would be if I was playing live. But, my speech is not forced. I'm not kind of like, really straining. There's a vein popping out the side of my head as I'm doing this. I'm nice and relaxed. Both hands are relaxed, my right hand and my left hand. You can hear the technique is nice and kind of consistent. And this allows me to have mental capacity left over for dealing with the other elements of music that I might want to do. Where do I want the line to go? What are the chord changes? What's the band doing? What's my time feel like, for example? And this is just good practice generally for when you're playing music. And you could hear there, I could keep improvising the line consistently, relatively, and my hand is not tired. There's not a ton of lactic acid in there. And that's because I'm not slamming my fingers down. I'm relying on good, consistent technique, and I'm relying on the guitar being well set up. If I'm trying to play a cheese grater, that's not going to work. But in this case, you've seen the action. I'm playing 10 to 46 strings. It's not like super slammed, really light gauge strings, but the consistency of my technique over years and years and years of practice is a thing that's developed to allow me to do that. Okay, so that's myth number 3. You do not need to slam your fingers down and pull off really hard and have like biceps on your fingers, when you're playing legato. It's just not necessary. So let's bust myth number 4. So myth number 4 is that in order to play legato, you need a ton of distortion and a bunch of compression, or both, either or. So in this case, again, this is one of those things that can be very useful. And from time to time, if I really want to be super consistent, maybe if I'm recording something for somebody, or if my hand is feeling tired, I might turn the compressor on. But you absolutely do not need compression or distortion to play legato, as you've heard throughout some of the playing in this video. It's not the case that the only way that legato players can play is to crank the distortion or the gain on the amp and then therefore make things easier for themselves. You should be able to play, just not even particularly quickly, nice and consistently, and still have a good sound without all of that compression and distortion. I have zero compression on here at all. I've got a little bit of delay and reverb. I'm going into a pretty clean amp. If I play hard, it's just slightly breaking up, but I've got my volume rolled down for the legato here and it's super clean. And again, very relaxed, okay? And again, this comes from good, consistent technique, lots and lots of practice, not being too heavy-handed with my technique, and also having the right guitar setup. The other thing you might want to do, and this is something I do with my tones, is I like to push the mids up on the amp a little bit. And that just lets the sound resonate a little bit more, brings some more harmonics into the scenario. It can often be, if you scoop your mids, a little bit anemic for clean sounds for legato. If you've got distortion and you've got compression on, these things become moot. You can tailor your EQ however you like. But if you listen to a lot of legato players who play with clean tones a lot, like Tim Miller, for example, or myself, you will hear the mids are often quite heavily cranked just to compensate with some of those extra harmonics, basically, and some girth in the middle of the tone. Okay, so on to myth number 5. So myth number 5, this is one that's close to my heart, is that people play legato because it's easier than alternate picking, or sweep picking, for example. This just isn't the case. And at first it might seem like it is. And I struggle with alternate picking. I have big problems with my alternate picking. Although I can alternate pick, I can pick fast, I'm not consistent with it like I am with my legato. So I understand as much as the next person just how difficult it is to alternate pick really, really well. But legato is deceptive. The hardest thing about legato is doing it consistently in time. So if all you have as your goal is to play as fast as possible, then legato is definitely easier to execute than alternate picking because you don't have to synchronize the hands to the same extent. Where the synchronization issue comes in is with time with legato. And this is where most people fall down in their legato journey. It's very, very difficult to execute subdivisions really, really well. And if you've ever explored this, you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about straight away. And this is down to a lot of the way the guitar is set up. So for instance, 3-note per string scales, if we want to play 16th notes where we're grouping things in fours, well, we immediately fall into a problem because we have a group of 3, followed by another group of 3, another group of 3, so on and so forth, and things end up feeling like triplets. To feel those groups of 4 consistently, 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a 1E and a 3E and a 4E and a 1 is very difficult because if I was alternate picking that, I could accent those beats. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, oops, 3, 4. As if to ironically demonstrate my issues with picking there with that mistake. That wasn't intentional, I promise. With legato, you can't do this. You can't go 1, 2 and slam that finger down for the accent. That's not going to work. Even Alan Holdsworth couldn't do that, the mighty Alan Holdsworth. So in this case, you've got to feel those subdivisions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, if you've never done this before, just that might be incredibly difficult for you to get through, just to count out those numbers, where this is basically a physical grouping of 3, then another physical grouping of 3. You're going to want these string changes to feel like each of the beats. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so on and so forth. Whereas what we actually want is 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. This takes a huge amount of control and practice. And once you've nailed it, this is just as hard as alternate picking to nail, then once you've nailed it, you'll be able to really consistently feel the time as you play on the instrument. Okay, so those are the 5 myths of legato technique that I wanted to talk to you about today. Hope you enjoyed them and found them useful. If you want to know more about legato technique, you can check out the links down below where you will find my Modern Legato Part 1, 2 and 3, which is a whole course that I've released quite a while ago now, but still very, very relevant, that teaches you my approach to legato, basically from first principles, basically around this kind of rhythmic idea of subdivisions. Teaches you tons of lines, the consistency of the technique, how to construct those lines for yourself, so on and so forth. So check that out if you're interested. Those are down below, the links to my website, so you can download those videos if you want to check those out. And of course, like I mentioned, use the code from the beginning of the video to get the discount on the Ultimate Fretboard Visualization course, and of course check out Solo version 2. All right guys, thank you so much for your support. Thanks for watching. Again, hope you found the video useful. If you did, of course, hit the like button and the subscribe button down below, and you know what to do with the bell. Hit the bell notification icon to be notified every time I upload new content. All right guys, my name's Tom Quayle. Thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye-bye.